Today's topic is Khojas and the English, 1700s to 1900s, pirates, city building, and railways. At one of our earlier meetings last year, Dr. Sipten Panjwani from England gave us an interesting presentation on migration of Khojas from Gujarat to Africa. And that recording is available on YouTube under Baraza Toronto. Today, our presentation will cover the period before the migration of Khojas in large numbers to Africa, late 1900s, early 2000. Our speaker, Mr. Iqbal Dewji, is a retired Toronto lawyer and an avid community historian. He has made it his mission to record the history of Khojas in East Africa, many of whom migrated from Gujarat. His source material comes from published academic records as well as from ancestral stories narrated by Khoja families. Mr. Dewji is the founder and editor of KhojaWiki.org, a not-for-profit initiative to record and store these stories. Through the hundreds of family stories online emerges the collective migratory history of Khojas of Western Gujarat. And with that brief introduction, Mr. Iqbal Dewji, over to you, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazmul. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, Yali Madad, and to my East African friends, I'm Jambo. I'd like to start by thanking the Baraza Group for this opportunity to talk to you about a subject that's really very close to my heart. Nazmul suggested that history being somewhat of a dry subject, I try to make it lively. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through some parts of the Khoja history and present to you some of the things that influenced them as they moved through what is very properly called a journey. So the subject today is, as Nazmul said, Khojas, Caribbean pirates, colonial cities, and jungle railways. And I'm going to do that through plenty of slides. I hope that works. If you get bored listening to me or looking at my face, feel free to switch to the slides mode, and that'll give you a bigger picture of the what's on screen. So you're going to say pirates, 1699, Khojas. You may ask, what's this all about? So I'd like to give you some background. As you can see, the Khojas appeared in Portuguese records from around the 1500s, and particularly Khoja Shamsuddin. He was a ship owner, a merchant, and he was so wealthy even then that he was a lender to the Portuguese governors of Goa. So all through their period, the early period, Portuguese early period, he's recorded as having transactions. He was also involved in their politics. Why were the Khojas able to operate in the Indian Ocean when the Portuguese came in with their ships armed with cannons and disrupted every other business? I believe it was because the Khojas were syncretic. They were Satpanthis, they were local in appearance, local in language. The Portuguese at the time were very much interested in war with what they call the Moors, which is the North African Arabs who had been holding on to Spain for a very long time, at the peninsula for a very long time at that period. So Khojas were able to sort of pass under the radar and were able to continue what they had been doing, I believe, for another at least 50 to 100 years before that. The information I provided mentions cartes, and cartes was basically ransom. Europeans, when they came into the Indian Ocean, they basically attacked any ship that did not have a document that they had paid them a license fee to operate in the Indian Ocean. You have to understand the Portuguese and all the Europeans were maritime forces, but the land in the Indian Ocean was controlled by the empires. There were like 3 empires at the time, and the Mughals controlled the Indian Empire. So because they had superiority in ships, this is what they were able to do. The other thing I want to point out to you is that the name Khoja, the word Khoja in front of the name, for over 5 centuries denoted that the person was a Khoja, and it was very proudly displayed. The last the last place where I saw it was at a graveyard of Jafar Bhai. Jafar Bhai was the son of Walidin Avisram, and this is in his graveyard in Mombasa, where the name Khoja is used. Of course, in India, it's used even as we speak. People put Khoja in front of their name. The other term in this slide you can see is the word Banyas. The early literature referred to all Indians as Banyas, but we know now that by the time we got to East Africa, we started using the Swahili term Banyani, which was then restricted to all Hindus. But the literature of this period includes the Muslims who traded very largely in this area as Banyas as well, as long as they were from the Indian subcontinent. So my next slide, you all remember the movie Mughal-e-Azam. Well, the Mughals were at that point very much in charge of Gujarat, and they were in charge of Surat, which was their main port for exports. And one of the things that Surat was famous for was its shipping fleet, which was largely owned by Muslim merchants. Now, the Mughals owned the port of Surat, but they allowed the English and other Europeans to be there. And these European trading posts did business with most of India from there. The Kedad merchant, the ship that I'm going to talk about today, was a large 400-ton ship. The shipbuilders were very advanced in Surat at the time. The Kedad merchant was built to last for 50 to 100 years. And I just will give you a small quote from a Dutch officer who visited Surat at the time. And he said, they make parts fit into each other with such great exactness that the seam is scarcely visible and the whole seems to form part of one entire piece of timber. My point is that Indian Ocean mercantile fleets were far in advance at the time than the European ships that came in. But there was a big difference. The European ships that came into the Indian Ocean came equipped with cannons on board. So the cannons gave them an advantage. They were able to shoot a ship down, sink it. But as soon as they hit land, they needed permission from the people that control the land. So this is how the consensual arrangements were worked out at that point, where the English and other Europeans had their trading posts there. So the Khadab merchant was fully laden, and it was on its way to go south from Surat when Captain Kidd, waylaid it. Captain Kidd used a trick to waylay it, to capture it. What he did was he put up on his own, when he saw the Khadab merchant, he put up on his own ship, he put up a French flag. Now at that time, France was at war with England. So the Khadab merchant, which had come from Surat, which had normally flew an English flag, put up a French flag. And then when he came on side, he changed his flag to his pirateer flag and boarded the ship. So he was able to board a much bigger ship through that trick. But Captain Kidd was a sanctioned pirate, which means that the British Crown had given him permission to go into the Indian Ocean and rob any ship that belonged to another nation. So he was a licensed pirate, just like the British had 007 license to kill. This was a licensed pirate. So in 1698, he captured the ship, and then he took it down to Cochin, and then from there he took it to Madagascar, and from there he took the ship right across the Atlantic to the Dominican Republic, where he sunk it after taking the cargo. And it was as you can see from the screen, it was a very wealthy cargo that he got from it. The ship itself is in the Dominican Republic right now. It's an undersea attraction. So if you check it out when you're in the Dominican someday, and if you feel like doing a little bit of scuba diving, you can go and see the ship. Now, what happened was that even though Kidd had the license to do this, he actually picked on the wrong ship, because the ship had cargo, 50% of his cargo belonged to a Mughal nobleman. And as I told you earlier, it was with Mughal permission that the British were able to be in Surat. The other 50% of the cargo belonged to some Armenian merchants in the Indian Ocean merchants. So these guys then ended up in a British court. And in the British court, the court found Kidd guilty of piracy. So he was then very cruelly hung in the docks of London. And for many centuries after that, it was considered that the ship belonged to the Armenians, because the Armenians who had the merchandise on the ship. But then in 1930, a Major Pierce, who was a colonial officer posted in Zanzibar and familiar with the Khojas, did some extra research. He went into the actual court records that were still in the UK. And he concluded that the ship belonged to a Surat merchant who was called Khoji. And the spelling of the name was Coirgi, which is a French way of spelling, of writing the word Khoji. So his conclusion was that it was a Surat merchant named Khoji, who was a Khoja. When I came across this matter, because I received some papers from a scholar in London called Shirin Walji. And in the material that Shirin sent me, there was a clip from a Gujarati newspaper, which was later on English, a Gujarati newspaper called Samachar. And the clip mentioned Captain Pierce's, Major Pierce's work and the fact that the ship was a Khoja ship. Very intriguing, but it gets even better. I started looking at Fazil Jan Mohammad, the editor of Samachar. And Fazil Jan Mohammad had come to Zanzibar to teach. And therefore his family, he's called Master, and his family is called Master. So Fazil Jan Mohammad Master. But he had a passion for journalism. And so he published the very first issue of Samachar in 1894. That was the first Indian newspaper in East Africa. The original prints were in Gujarati, but in around, I think, 1901 or 1902, he started publishing in English. And the Samachar continued as a publication all the way till 1964. And it was during the revolution that it ceased publication. Also wanted to point out one other thing, and that is that the first printing press in Africa, south of Egypt, was actually in Zanzibar. So Zanzibar had a tradition of print and of culture, and Mr. Master was able to get into it, and he was the one who started that newspaper that has continued for so long. I'm going to let you read this because this is the backup for Mr. Master's position in the Khoja hierarchy. So when after Kidd was hanged, the Mughals were pacified. The British continued with their trading, and eventually they ended up buying a Portuguese settlement called Bombay, which is like a bomb, is like in Portuguese means good, and Bia means bay. So it was Bombay, which we now know as Bombay. So they got that as a dowry payment from the Portuguese, because one of the Portuguese princesses was married to an English king, and what the English did was they started to encourage the traders that they knew from Surat to come on down to settle in Bombay. And essentially, these traders started what we know as Bombay. Now, the traders from Surat included Khojas as well. So the Khojas began to thrive under this orderly Victorian society, and that's where their actual connection began with the English, a connection that, as we know, lasted for 3 centuries. This slide shows you the fact that they started to become financially settled very earlier on. As early as 1790, they owned a graveyard in Dongri, which became their settlement area. So if they had a graveyard in 1790, then it tells you that they were capable of buying something like that even at that time. They also owned the Jamaat Khanna building, which also was a large building, and it was in 1804. It was worth at least 1700 rupees for them to send it out as religious dues to Iran. I went to Dongri in 2019, and it was a very interesting visit for me personally, because I had lived in India when I was a small child. My father had gone from East Africa for a few years, and so I had actually lived in Dongri. So going back was nostalgic. In Dongri, I went to visit the Qabristan, the one that I mentioned. It's still there. It's got a lot of buildings in there. There's a Sunni mosque in there. I'm not sure how the history goes, how it ended up having that mosque, but the gravestones are very interesting because they go back in history. I met an old lady outside the graveyard. It was interesting because she was on a cutlaw just outside the graveyard doors on the sidewalk, and she called me over when she saw me, and she started to talk to me, and she said, "I'm a Khoja," and I said, "You sleep here?" She said, "Yeah, I live here. This is my home." I said, "Oh, okay." And then she explained to me that she said, "All my family is in Mozambique. Everybody is gone, so I'm alone here." I just thought it was how it connected me to how India connected me to Africa, and Africa connected me to India at that very moment. It's quite a thing for me. Then I also went to the Jamaat Khanna building, and in the Jamaat Khanna, which is a very nice, elegant old property, I'm sure it's been built over many times. There is an old there is a part which is near the entrance gate to the Jamaat Khana, where on the right hand side you see this structure, and it is a zari. And I'm told that it is used by all Khojas in Bombay to today. So it tells you how far our history goes. This Jamaat Khana probably is under a trust document, and that's why it's usable by everybody. I'm not sure of that, but that's what I think. So my next slide is the growth of the population, Khoja population in Bombay. There is no authoritative paperwork on this, but what I've done is I've gleaned it out of the materials that I've read. And some of the material is, of course, in the famous case, the Aga Khan case, where the lawyer for the Imam was able to present some statistics relating to the Khojas. And then there was a very strong press in Bombay at the time. So the press reported everything that was going on in that case. And therefore you could go to this, for example, British Library has newspapers from all around the world. So you can actually see the reporting in those newspapers. Some of the material, some of the information has come from oral traditions that the Khojas have maintained with respect to their settlement there. And as you can see, some of it is from books that have been written about the Khojas and the diaspora. The impetus to come to Bombay came from the fact that first it was merchants. They came because there were opportunities in India. Bombay became a major port during this time for the British, and they created the enabling environment. So the Khojas were able to come and do business there. And then they called their relatives, and that's how the community grew. But also there was the fact that at this time there were many famines in North India, particularly Gujarat suffered quite a few famines. And if you go to Khoja Wiki, you will see an article on the impact of famines on Khoja migrations. People were able to take advantage of their kith and kin that had gone out. They had a place to go. And the oral tradition of the Khojas is that one huge group came from Junagadh, 1,500 of them arrived at one time into Bombay. You should look at famines, and you will see that the records of the famines. You'll see that there was a particular reason why these famines happened so often during British times. What the British did was create railways in India that were geared towards the export of commodities, export of Indian goods such as textiles and silks and stuff. And these railways were built to go to the ports. And so when there was a famine, there was no enough transportation to take stuff to the areas that had problems. And you can read all about that because that's been well documented. And I've extracted some of the material there. The other thing I want to point out is that the Khojas had a very strong structure during this period. So we're talking about 1890s to 1990s. They had very strong community institutions. These were the same institutions that had been inaugurated by the Khoja Pir Sadruddin, who basically organized the Khojas into a cohesive community. The Khojas as a people have been around from earlier than that, but the institution of a Jamaat Khanna with a Mukhi and a Kamaria, and also the institution of a Justi, a kind of an elder council selected from amongst the elders by the elders themselves, which ran the Jamaat Khanna and ran the Khoja fortunes at the time. That was a very strong institutional structure that helped the Khojas move when they had to move quickly. They were able to help their fellow Khojas in Kutch, Kathiawar, and Sindh. This is the picture of the Indy Bazaar, which became the big settlement area for the Khojas. They call it Khoja Mohalla in Bombay. And as the Khojas came in, they went into small business shops, retail shops. And what's interesting about this period is that the pattern that they followed was the same pattern that was followed in East Africa. And that is that the ones that were already established or had little shops already going, they would invite the relatives to come in, give them some apprenticeship practice, then give them some goods to open their own shop, maybe pay the rent for the shop for a little while, and then the pattern would be repeated. It was the same thing then that happened once my ancestors went to East Africa. Underpinning this entire structure of the Khojas was this business of trust. And the trust was not only between the Khojas themselves, where they considered a debt to be a subject of honor, but it was also something that they did with respect to their interactions with outsiders. What that meant was that when they were going out in groups to trade, like for example, there was Khoja traders that would go around the lower slopes of the Himalayas, Simla and those places. They would collect goods from Bombay or Delhi, and then they would take these goods over to those areas in groups, and they would have a leader called a Jamidar, and they would supply goods on credit to the farmers. And a lot of you from East Africa will notice the similarity. And we're talking around 1860s, 1870s. And during that time, they would work as a team. They would farm out certain villages to each other. If, for example, any of these Khojas, then the merchandise that they brought with them, the merchandise would be bought from traders, big traders in the cities, who lent the goods to them on credit, so they could lend it out to the farmers on credit. But if any one of them defaulted, the rest of them would come together quickly and pay off the debt, because the name of the group was very important to the Khojas. And their own name was important because they called it something, I read about it, it was called the good name. So the good name of the Khoja trader was his mark of respect and his mark of credit. If you didn't have a good name, you were not going to get credit, not from your fellow Khojas and not from outsiders. And sometimes the Khoja families themselves would pay the debt of a deceased member of their family, if that person left with debt. Because once again, the keys to entry to this world of retail trade and then wholesale trade was the good name of the person. So Khoja started coming in from Sindh, from Gujarat. Some of the successful merchants in those areas considered it an upward mobility for them to come to Bombay and do business. And to wrap this part up, the trade that the Khojas did, as you can see this little clip about how they cornered the rice trade, the retail rice trade. But then after that, later on in 1870s, they went into cotton and import-export of cotton. And also was something curious, they also supplied opium to China. And that was a legitimate trade in those days. And the people who did business with China became very, very wealthy. And they were not just Khojas, but others did the same business. And many of them are called Chinois. You may know the name Chinoi in India. It's popular amongst many communities. This slide I have here is really has a pride of place for me, because I read about Nancy Parpia in Judy Aldrich's book. Some of you may have read it, but if you haven't, I suggest that you get a copy. It's a very, very informative book about Zanzibar and about a principal character in Zanzibar, Pira Dewji. But I'll get into Pira Dewji in a minute. But the photo is, it was mentioned in there that there is a photograph in this book of Johnson, the Peoples of Bombay. It was published in 1863. So I was curious, I wanted that photograph because it said it was a picture of Nancy Parpia. And as we know, there is no picture, as I know now, there is no picture, no photograph of Khojas that I know of that period, of the 1850s. So a Khoja Wiki volunteer, Karim Jivraj of London, he ventured to go into the British Library and then found the photograph, was able to take a picture of the photograph, and then we were able to get it out and publish it. Dewji Parpia was in Zanzibar, I'm sorry, but Nancy Parpia, he was a trader, a merchant, but a tailor as well. He imported goods, clothing goods, English merchandise. And he was he was a favorite store of the English employees of the East India Company. This is how they ended up taking a picture of him at the time, and then it appeared in Johnson's book. Now, an interesting connection of this Nancy Parpia is that Nancy Parpia was the uncle of Dewji Pira, the person that I mentioned in the Judy Aldrich's book. Now, Dewji Pira was Sultan Barghash's, Zanzibar Sultan Barghash's unofficial prime minister. He started out he was looking after the lamps, it said.
No, it wasn't Nancy Parpia.
So Dewji started out as a
Dewji was.
as a unofficial prime minister, and he started out making he was in charge of the lamps, and then he grew and he became in charge of the stables, and he worked with it. In fact, he visited the UK twice during this period with the Sultan. He came over to buy ships. He came over as an emissary of the Sultan. And the interesting thing is that he took in East Africa, he took a different position with respect to the British presence. He was supporting the Sultan, resisting the creeping British influence. So, and at that time, the other influence that they were latching onto was the Germans. So it was the British-German rivalry, and Dewji Pira suggested he worked with the Sultan to establish contacts with the Germans. In fact, he was exiled by the British. He was exiled to Bombay, and he continued his connections with the Germans in Bombay. He eventually was allowed to come back. Sultan Bargash was also exiled, so both of them were eventually allowed to come back, and that's how he ended up being. When he came back, he stopped working with the Sultan's political problems, but he continued to work with the Sultan in terms of entertainment. Now, the other person that worked for the Sultan as well was Taria Topan. But Taria, he ended up getting a title from the British. So one has to look into what was going on at the time as to what particular intrigues were going on that created that anomaly. I would urge, there are many Parpias in East Africa and Parpias also in Bombay. I would urge them to look into this illustrious history of their ancestors. And Khoja Wiki really tries to do that. You know, if you wish to explore history, we will be there to help you do it. I have some photographs of the what Bombay Khojas wore. I want to make two or three comments here. First of all, the Khojas were Satpanthis, so they never adopted the parda or the burqa when the Wahhabis made that popular. They continued with Indian dresses, although they were distinctive to the Khojas. The ladies, of course, had their bandhanis, which are cherries and bandhanis. And I just want to let you know that at Khoja Wiki, we've started a collection of photographs of ladies with different bandhanis. So bandhani collection, because they are really beautiful garments. The men had their own styles. It's basically, if you look at the old Khoja photographs, you'll see it was a long coat. Initially, there was just a shalwar at the bottom, but as Bombay got more fashionable, The Khojas also developed more distinctive styles. There was long dress coats and stylish hats. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who had been to England, the UK, so when he came back, he was always a very good dresser. So when he came back, he upped the game, and you see his photographs. You see him with very elegant gold trimmings and buttons on his coats that he wore. If you want to see his picture, you can go to Khoja Wiki and you'll see it in our article called Early Khojas in Bombay, Khojas in Early Bombay. I want to add one thing. The fact that the Khojas did not have parda or burqa meant that it created an atmosphere for them of faster economic growth compared to other conservative competitors such as the Memons, the Bhatiyas, and even their fellow Loanas. The Khojas were able right away to incorporate their women into their business. So even in Bombay, in those little rice shops that we mentioned earlier, the women were full participants. We fast forward to East Africa, you have the same scenario. You have the Khojas will go into the interior, start a shop, get acquainted. After a few months, first of all, they would bring in a spouse, go to India, find a spouse, come back. She would learn the language, and then in a short order, she would then look after the store, while the Khoja male husband would then go into buying produce and expand the business. This has been a pattern for about 100 years in East Africa, and it started with Bombay. I was at the Khoja Studies Conference in Bombay University a few years back, and this exhibit was from there. And I think that it's a wonderful exhibit that they had of pictures, artifacts, and I think it would be very, very nice if this exhibit were to come to Toronto and was taken to other places in the West. I'm going to talk about some of the luminaries of the Khoja world at that time. And this is where the city builders comes in. They were no less than 7 Khojas owned very large, they were very large mill owners. Industrialists, merchant princes. In 1860s, Bombay was the pole of the Indian Ocean and the Far East, and its leading inhabitants were very wealthy, became very wealthy as a consequence. At one time, Indian merchants were wealthier than their English masters. And we will go into a person in a short while that's fabulous for his wealth. Here's a partial list of the luminaries to the 1800s, and you can see in there ship owners, manufacturers, a lot of civic leaders, a lot of title holders. They were in every kind of industry that you could think of in Bombay. Manufacturing, construction, building construction. One of the largest property owners in Bombay are the Jairaj boys. Here's another list that I was able to pull out in terms of city building. Not less than 12 mayors of Bombay during this period were Khojas. But their accomplishments were more than just these. Their accomplishments started much earlier. In 1825, the first modern school in Khoja history was established in Bombay. 1825. With the presence of the British, there were other schools being built in Bombay, other communities were building schools. So the Khojas were no less. They were there too, building their own facilities, community facilities. In 1850, an English medium school was started by one Kasam Bhai Natabai. I know this because this is mentioned again in the Al Khan case, that it was a very progressive vision on their part. And the result of that was something like what you see in front of you. Now, I'm going to mention one person, Rahimtullah Sayani. And being a lawyer, I checked him out. He wrote his LLB exam in 1870 in Bombay, and then promptly became a fellow of Bombay University, which is a very, very important university in India. And then later became the first Muslim Sharif of Bombay. And Sharif was a sort of a honorific title, non-political, but it meant that one person got appointed as a Sharif every year in Bombay. And he was the first Muslim to be appointed as Sharif of Bombay. Now, the prince of the Khojas at the time was Sir Karimbo Ibrahim. His entrepreneurship was incredible. He started with an inheritance. His father had a business that they started in Mandvi, and then from there they came to Bombay. His father came to Bombay, and Karimbo himself took over that business. His first foray in entrepreneurship was that he opened branches in 1857 in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and in Japan. After his father passed away, he took the company and turned it into an industrial empire. And you can see how many mills that he had over there in Bombay. By 1910, Sir Karimbo Ibrahim was the wealthiest Indian in the world. One American newspaper called him the Pope of the Khojas because of the charities that he did. He had numerous museums, schools, hospitals. He was involved in so many things in Bombay during his time. And he got a hereditary title from the British. And what's interesting about this hereditary title is that it's one of I think he's and Amir Bhatia of UK, Lord Bhatia. Those are the two hereditary titles amongst the Khojas. And by that I mean the title passes down generation to generation. I'm not too familiar with their system, the British system on titles, but I understand that all the other titles that are given are personal to the person, and that if they are repeated in their progeny, it is because of what the progeny has done themselves for the British Crown. But this title is continuous, and there is a Sir something Karimbo, Sir Ibrahim number 4 in India at the moment. So in the list that I showed you before, you saw the name of Tharia Topan. So Tharia was from East Africa, but he was there in Bombay. He had an office in Bombay. So I'm going to now take you to East Africa and take you to the third part of the connection, which is the railways. But I have to give you a little background. Of course, the Khojas have been actively written up as being in the Indian Ocean from the 1500s, for sure. But we have record of their presence. The first recorded presence is in Zanzibar in 1820. There was a small community, and it was run like the ones in India by two functionaries. The English call them amuldaris. As you can see, there were 2,500 Khojas also in East Africa by that time. Now, we have a record of one person in Tabora, Musa Kanji, who used to be called Musa Mzuri. And we know about him because in the 1850s, when the so-called explorers came there, the European explorers, Burton and Grant, they found him there. They used him. They needed him. He was the one who explained to them about the Great Lakes. And in fact, he was the one who told Speke, Burton and Speke, as you know, the rivalry between them. He told Speke about the great river that comes out of Victoria that was the Nile. Now his ancestors, Musa Kanji's ancestor, his brother was there too, Cheyenne. His ancestors came from Surat, the same Surat that we talked about earlier. So Surat and Mombasa, they were connected with the ancient East African monsoon trade that the merchants of Gujarat used to come down during the right season. But I have no information as to when he came to Mombasa, but he was definitely in the interior in Tabora by 1850s, and he told the explorers that his family had been in Tabora since 1820s. Why Tabora? Because Tabora was a major Arab settlement. It was in fact an Arab town in the interior of East Africa. So it's possible that the Mombasa Arabs and the Zanzibar Arabs, and then he would have come through one of those trading expeditions. Just to give you some context, my own grandfather, his name was Muhammad Dewji, and he was born in Sadani, just near Bagamoyo, in 1875. I would think that he came from Muscat. He would have come via Muscat, because there was a lot of connection between Gwadar, Kutch, and then Muscat, and then Zanzibar. And when the Sultan of Zanzibar came down, a lot of Khojas came down with him from Muscat to Zanzibar. To the next slide.
Iqbal.
Yes.
Yeah. Just a minute. To our audience, and Iqbal, of course, you as well. We are on the 3-hour mark, which is, when we start winding down. But this presentation is so interesting, and you have so much information there. So I request the audience to bear with us. Iqbal will continue with the presentation. He'll finish that, and then we'll go through your questions, comments, etc. Iqbal, is that okay? You can stay on?
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Please continue.
So railways. So the first, the owner of building the first railway in East Africa, you'd be surprised, doesn't go to the Europeans. The first railway was built by Sultan Burgash. in 1870s, he built a 7-mile railway from his palace in Stone Town in Zanzibar to the beach. And the purpose of the railway was to have his multiple wives go and eat some air, as they said in those days, at the beach. That railway was, of course, used by other Zanzibaris, and I'm sure people in the audience are familiar with some of the history behind that. The second railway was actually built by the Germans, and they built one because they wanted to settle the Kilimanjaro area. So they had a very brutal time with the Arusha tribe, pacified them, and also the Chagas in Moshi. And so the northern line was started, and in 1893, that's how they were the second line to start, and it reached Moshi in 1912. I've shown you two pictures. The first is the German Boma in Moshi in 1906. And this is when Natahirji, whose family was very prominent in Moshi, that's when he arrived. So this is what he would have seen. And there's a description of the Boma. It says the Boma was a fairly large place consisting of a government station in charge of 3 or 4 white officers with about 100 native soldiers. The principal civilian residents were 2 Greek traders who owned some coffee plantations. So this is what they would have seen. The Germans would have pacified the Chagas just a little bit earlier, maybe 5 or 8 years earlier than that. And they would have been encouraged to come and settle there by the German planters, perhaps in Tanga. There's a very nice account written by a friend of mine, Patni. I'm missing his name right now, but he's written an account of how his ancestors came to Mombasa, and then from there they came to Moshi, and how they were taken to the German administrator, who then just made a mark on the ground on a piece of paper and said, okay, this is your land, now go start a shop. It was that simple, but they didn't speak the language. They just were able to understand that they were there for that purpose, to start a shop. I've got some names of people that a lot of people from Moshi may be familiar with. Hassan Ali Sajan, auto store. His father, Sergeant Samji, came in 1908. The firm of Sharif Dewji, which was a leading group in East Africa, arrived in Moshi. I'm sorry, but I'm rushing here. What did I do here? Oh, I'm going forward rather than backward. Okay. I must get back. I apologize. There we are. So Sharif Dewji's family came in, and they were established in other places in East Africa, more to the coast, but they came in and they decided that Moshi was important. And my point here is that Moshi was important because of the railway. Mulji Nazar Ali, again, another very prominent family in am I in the wrong spot?
You're on the right spot, but do present us. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So Mulji Nazar Ali also came in, and he was also very helpful to the people that followed him. He settled quite a few people. But as you can see from the second photograph, by 1914, there was actually buildings now there that in the Indian part of town. That means the Khojas had progressed enough that they started building structures for their shops. So it made a big difference. The railway allowed them to come in. They had security of the German Boma, and they started trading with the Chagas, who were very wealthy because they had incorporated the whole idea of growing coffee which the Germans brought to them. My next slide is to do with the great lunatic railway that went from Mombasa to Kisumu. You can see that this was the beginning of the Dukawala phenomena in Kenya and Uganda. The British built this railway because they figured that Uganda was very, very fertile. Kenya itself on the highlands was very settleable, but they needed a railway to bring the produce from those places to the coast. And they needed this produce to be export market, export quality, if you like. So they needed setups of plantations. And to do that, they needed shopkeepers, they needed traders. So first they brought in, of course, the laborers that we have heard about, the people who actually built the railway. But the traders were equally important, and I'm going to go through to show you how. So I would like to say that even though Uganda Railway, created Kenya and Uganda, but it was really the king of that enterprise was Ali Din Avisram, who enabled that railway to do that. You can read up some very entertaining books about the man-eaters of Sao and how thousands of laborers died and building that railway. And in these books, of course, these books are about great white hunters that came in and killed those lions. But I think that Ali Din Avisram's life is a testament to the great entrepreneurial spirit of the Khojas, who could see an opportunity and go for it. And he saw the railways as an opportunity in Kenya. And I'll talk about in a minute about his nephew, Nasser Riji, who saw the same opportunities in Tanzania once the Germans built their railway. So Ali Din Avisram, he opened 170 branches of his company in what was then called British East Africa and Uganda. He brought dhows on the Lake Victoria, and a steamer too. He brought it all the way from the coast and then had it built on the lake. Ali Din Avisram was non-sectarian, and he learned that from his benefactor and his employer, Sewa Haji Paru. So Ali Din Avisram works for Sewa Haji Paru for a while, and then he takes over Sewa Haji's business, and then he expands it greatly as he did. And both him and Sewa Haji were non-sectarian. So they helped all the Khojas who came, as well as helping the Christian missions to build schools, churches, hospitals, etc. One of the things that there's a very nice book that I'm going to refer you to in a minute, but Ali Dina's is quoted as saying in Uganda he started to buy produce from the farmers. He introduced products to them, they grew it, and then he bought it from them. And he's stated as saying this: pay the producer a fair price, Ali Dina commanded his managers. Do not underpay an illiterate peasant. Ali Dina will not stand accused. Now, in English, it doesn't really convey the power of the last sentence. The very important to a lot of Eastern cultures, and particularly the Vepari culture, is that the idea that you don't stand accused. That means you don't do something for which a finger can be pointed to you. And their name was very important to them. Ali Dina was like that. He was considered very fair, tough but fair, but he also was conscious of the fact that his example would be right across Kenya and Tanzania because of all these hundreds and hundreds of dukawalas that he promoted, that he got into business. I'm going to show you a list of people that I've gleaned. These are just names that I gleaned out of the Khoja Wiki database. They are not exhaustive at all. I may have missed out some of your own great families, but this is, I call them Ali Dina's men, and I have a reason for doing that. Those young people that went to Ali Dina Visram School in Mombasa, they're very proud of the fact that they went there. It's a great school, and they call themselves Ali Dina's boys. And you see their webpage, and it's a sense of history that they carry with them throughout their lives. I call these people Ali Dina's men, and sometimes some people have objected to that term, Ali Dina's men, but I think I use it in a sense of honor that through these men, hundreds of families were able to settle in East Africa, in Kenya and Uganda. There are hundreds of people whose future success of their families is tied to Ali Dina and Simon and also Nasser Virji, but I'll get into that in a minute. I'm going to run through some of the people here. Many of you are familiar with Qasim Lakha and the families of Qasim Lakha in Kisumu. Similarly, in Kisumu, you have Hashim Jamal Pardhan, which a lot of us know. Wanam Zuri, it was called Wanam Zuri. And Haji Nur Muhammad in Eldoret. In the middle of nowhere, he grows up to be a dukawala with 10, 11 shops. In Uganda, Muhammad Ali Ramtullah, I don't know if people read my article on Muhammad Ali Ramtullah of Mbale. He went from dukawala to mills and then to plantations. An amazing story I've called him a millennium man because of his very progressive views at the time. A transporter in Uganda, Masaka, Bali again, Wasanji Gamji, and Mohammad Manek. I think a lot of people are familiar with Mohammad Manek, with Jinja, transporter, merchant. All these people proudly will tell you that it was the break that they got from Ali Dina. He basically hired them first couple of years. They would look after his shop. Once they were familiar, he would say, okay, you can take some goods from me. And if you return the money for these goods, you'll get more goods and you'll grow. And that's how they grew. So yeah, so I just wanted to make one last comment on Ali Dina and then we move on. And that is that it's said that almost all the shopkeepers in the entire East Africa shut down their business on the day Ali Dina al-Islam was buried in 1916. It was actually in the middle of the First World War. He was held in very high esteem. Now, in Tanganyika, there was also plans to start a railway, the Central Railway, they called it. And it got a little waylaid because the Germans faced a lot of resistance the Germans were very tough in their ways. And so they were facing, they didn't have much experience in neither in Africa or in colonizing countries. So they were kind of heavy-handed, and they faced a lot of resistance. There was the original Arab revolt in 1885. It's called the Abu Shiri revolt. It affected the coastal, disrupted the whole coastal network, Bagamoyo, and Dar es Salaam as well. And then in 1891, there was the battles, the freedom battles that were fought in Iringa by the Hehe people, who gave them a tough time. Chief Mkwawa, some people from Tanzania will remember the high school that was called Mkwawa Secondary School near Dar es Salaam. So that was his people, and they fought really hard. In fact, they fought so hard, eventually when he was caught, the Germans vandalized his body. They cut his head off, took it to Germany, put it in a museum, and it was only returned, I think, about 30, 40 years ago, back to Tanzania. And then there was the famous Majimaji Rebellion, which I call it a war, books call it a rebellion, but it was essentially the local population was forced to go into producing cotton and cash crops. And the way the Germans did that was basically they said, okay, every hut in the country got to pay some money. There's a hut tax. So these people were not into cash economy. They were always exchanging whatever they needed through barter. So then all these people were forced to go and work for the Germans to earn the money to pay the tax or to grow their own cash crops and sell them. So the Majimaji Rebellion also delayed them. But by 1905, they were able to start the railway. And the railway followed the central route, the old route that the Arab traders had used. And a lot of Khojas had used too, because by that time there were Khojas all along this area. And I'll talk about one family also a little later. So Nasser Dewji was the kingpin of the retail trade in Tanzania.
Iqbal?
Yes.
Iqbal, how many more slides do you have? Because we're already at almost 3:20, and I know we want to leave time for question answer, right?
Okay, so I'm going to just go over very quickly a couple of slides, and that's it.
You have lots of information, very informative. You've done a lot of research, but yeah, I'm just mindful of the time for the audience as well.
I'm appreciative of that. Thank you. Okay, and that's a bit sad because I wanted to talk about Nasser Dewji. But Nasser Dewji was his father, Virji Muraj, was a brother of Alidina's wife. So the connection was thick. I understand also that there was a connection also with Alidina's mother, but I'm not sure of that as to what exactly it was. So they did business together, and then after that, once Nasser was trained, he was able to go out on his own. And many of you may be familiar with Manza Trading Company, very large enterprise in the areas around the lake. There is a book about their travel I want to mention. It's a great little book. It's called Navison the Trailblazer, and it talks about the two of them traveling together inside. And it's like a fiction. It's a fiction based on truth, but they chat with each other and they talk about it based on what the character is. It was written by a person called M.G. Visram. I'm not sure if people are familiar, but this gentleman was from Mombasa, and I think his niece is in Vancouver, and she sent us a book at one time. I have the book. I just want to tell you, if a lot of people want it, we can try and see if we can put it online, the book, or persuade her to make a print of it. But it's a great little book, and it gives you an idea of the kind of cooperation people had at the time in order to be able to go into the bush and create what they have created for us. Very quickly now, the next slide is some of the people who thrived because of the central line. Again, all these people were able to go to where they were going because of the central line. And I know that it was because of the central line, because I checked, the Germans produced 3 or 4 colonial volumes of who was in the handbook, they called it. And you could see who was there in 1904 and then look at who was there in 1908, and you can tell which time they would have come in between. So most of the people that you see here came during that period. When the railway came to their town, they came. I put a little clip from somebody's personal history in which they say how they left a little town called Kilimatindi and went to Dodoma because the railway came to Dodoma and didn't come to Kilimatindi. Moving along quickly, I wanted to make one comment from my side, and that is that it's a pity that young scholars, they want to write about conquests in the Middle East and European history and American history, but fail to study the great stories of accomplishments of our own ancestors. Our ancestors were very peaceful. They conquered. They made lives for themselves. They became important people in the societies they went to, but they went in peace. And this is very important. There's a Gujarati writer who wrote about East African merchants, and here's the phrase he used, which I found very interesting. He says, "It is the tradition of non-violence generally associated with pragmatic business norms." So as a trading community, as a merchant community, as a business community, our people had to have the ability to interact with everybody. And this is something that you can see all the way through, whether it was in Kutch, in Kathiawar, and they moved from Sindh to Kutch and Kathiawar, or whether it was in Mozambique in the 1700's, it was in East Africa, or even later when they went to China, for example. They were always able to blend in and do business. Vepar mein dhyan diyo, as they say in Kutchi. Bas, vepar mein dhyan diyo. I think that it would be nice if some of the young people were to choose. There's lots of history that you can choose. You can write a PhD, you can write a paper on aspects of our history, and it would be definitely interesting, and it would definitely be worthy of scholarly research. Okay, I have one more housekeeping thing to do, and that is the launch of this book. The book is very much what Khoja Wiki has been trying to encourage for 5 years. It's a personal story, it's a personal journey, and it's also interspersed with Nazneen's family's history, her parents. I chose this particular paragraph because she gives tribute to her mother. This is something that touched me because I give tribute to my mother in my own story that I've written on Khoja Wiki, because she's given tribute to her mother and described her well as to how ahead of her time she was. So I think this is the kind of stuff that Khoja Wiki encourages. We like this book very much. People keep saying the ones who received your book, have been spellbound by reading it, can't seem to put it down. The book is available. If you send me an email, you'll see my email at the end of this presentation. You send it to me, I will forward it to Nazneen, and she will send you a book. It's $10 plus postage. She has to recover postage as well. My last concluding remark is about Khoja Wiki. What is Khoja Wiki? Khoja Wiki is a collaborative project, started about 6 years ago. I realized that history was getting lost. What we do at Khoja Wiki is record each family's history and create a community tree out of the family trees, but give enough space on the web for people to write what they want. And you can share your username and password so others can come in and add to the story. If you don't know enough about your great granddad, maybe one of your distant cousins can fill in that story. So then that becomes a repository. It becomes a place where your history is recorded forever. We have 25,000 names on our family tree. We have 300 personal stories. And we've got at least 30 essays that we've done with respect to Khoja settlement. If you want to use it, send me an email and I'll send you a couple of FAQs on how to be able to use it. So I'm going to leave this picture here. This is a map of what so far what I've learned about Khoja migrations, how they migrated out from Multan to Sindh to Kutch to Kathiawar to Bombay to East Africa to Muscat, and today some of us are sitting in Canada, USA, Europe, and also in the Far East. So you can mull over this. There is my email address at the top, and there is also the address for khojawiki.org. I want to thank you, everybody, for listening to me, and pass it on to Najmul. Over to you, Najmul.
Actually, you'll pass it on to Bashir Versi, who will manage the chat. So basically, I think at this stage, Bashir will go through the chat and raise all the important issues, questions, whatever. But just a request that we keep this brief, responses and everything, so that we can get through as many comments as possible. It's already 3:30. We don't want to keep everyone here too long. Thank you. But I'm really grateful to all the 114 people who are still in the audience.
So am I.
Yeah, no. You paid them well.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
No. Very interesting presentation, a lot of research and very well laid out. And I'm just sorry that I had to sort of rush you. So Bashir, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Iqbal, that was an excellent presentation. We've got a number of comments praising you to the skies for the work that you put in this one. But obviously there's no time for all that. We have amongst our participants a gentleman who's done a lot of research in this particular topic, and maybe I could request him to make some comments on today's presentation and perhaps even talk about his particular work very briefly. So I would ask Dr. Hasnain Walji to unmute himself and give us a brief comment.
Thank you, Bashir Bhai. Thank you, Nazmul, and thank you, Iqbal. It's been a wonderful 1.5 hours, and I will not hog the time of the audience asking Iqbal questions, because Iqbal and I have worked together for many, many years. We have a common passion. Just a couple of points. I made like 9 points. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just one main point is we have a documentary, a 2-hour documentary, and what Iqbal was describing about Dongri and other places is all vividly represented. And number 2, Iqbal mentioned the exhibition that we held at the Khoja Studies Conference, where you'll be pleased to know that the exhibition has now been shipped to your very city of Toronto at the Molaskar Memorial Resource Center, and hopefully it will be enacted in the next few months. With regards to the railways, Iqbal, you made a fantastic point in terms of the railway. All I need to say on that one is that 2,500 miles of railway, 500 Indians lost their lives. Sorry, I beg your pardon, that's the other way around. 500-mile railway, 2,500 Indians lost their lives, 5 Indians per mile. And they have been written out of the history of East Africa and the railways, unfortunately. So I take your point in terms of our young people picking up some of these nuances of our history, both the Asian history in East Africa, as well as the Khoja history, where we are able to record and for posterity, educate the generations to come. One of the things that has been missing, and that was also missing to a degree when I started the documentary, was, by the way, the link to the documentary will be provided on chat. It's a 2-hour documentary, was the role of women. The role of women in the Khoja community. The women have played a major role. And I do believe that as researchers, we need to focus on the role of women. Our dear friend, Mr. Somji, has done a great amount of work through his book Beat By, and I would recommend that those interested in that would be able to read that. And obviously, last not but the least, at the Mullah Askar Memorial Resource Center in the very city of Toronto, at the ISIJ campus, we have over 100 digitized books on Khoja history. And if you're at all interested, you may visit the library online and you'll be able to get more information on that. With that said, thank you so much, Iqbal. Your presentation was indeed very revealing, and I do believe that more of this needs to be discussed by our Khoja community. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bashir, for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Walji. Again, number of comments, a number of questions, very limited time. So obviously we'll have to go over some and not ask some of the other questions. Mohammed Jawad Kaki, why do you think Khojas have not been able to make a huge impact on the global scene as a universal area in areas like microfinancing, as Muhammad Yunus was able to do in Bangladesh, if they were able to devise a good social structure to administer loans within the Khoja community?
It's beyond the scope of my knowledge to respond to that. I focused on the history going backwards, and particularly early history of the Khojas, which I think is in danger of being lost with people passing on. So I've really not focused on the current situation of the Khojas or their social economic history.
Okay, so would you know, this is Batul Hashim, would you know if there is a listing or directory of those buried at the Dongri Kabristan, the current Khoja Ismaili Kabristan?
No, I don't think there is. I don't think that sorry. I don't think that there is a list like that's sitting over there. I don't think so. But I believe that the cemetery is Kabristan is a trust property, and therefore there may be some trust facilities that come to play on that.
Okay, Shokat Damji wants to know if there is any reason why the Kabristan is so neglected.
I think that the families whose ancestors are buried there have moved on to other parts of the world. There may not be knowledge. I mean, not many people know where the third, like their grandfathers, have been buried. So it may be that, but I'm not sure if there is a trust, and I don't know if there is a fund to look after it. I'm not familiar with any of that. All I did was go and visit it because I thought it was amazing to see our history right there in the middle of Dongri.
The question again by Mohammed Jawad Kaki, did the 1947 split up of the Indian subcontinent have a positive or negative impact on the Khojas?
There may be a political scientist in the audience that wants to answer that.
Going over very quickly, how important is the Gujarati language in Khoja history? With views of Gujarati declining in the community, how will it impact the modern day Khoja communities?
That's an interesting question because, first of all, the literature that exists of the Khojas, the early literature is in Khojki. There's a lot of Khojki scripts, manuscripts, etc., that are written in Khojki, but perhaps they are of Kutchi or Sindhi or Gujarati. So that would be very helpful. But there's a lot of later literature. Anything that's between 1840s, 1850s to later on, it's Gujarati was a common language with the Khojas. So there's a lot of literature. So I myself suffer from that. We had a teacher that they started the Akado Bakado and we never went beyond that. So I'm a victim of that situation where we took it less seriously. And so I don't speak Gujarati, and there's tons of literature that I cannot access because of that. But the good news is that a lot of this literature is going online now, and you can use Google Translate to translate it, and it'll give you a fairly reasonable translation to be able to use it.
Yeah. Shabir Mamdani, how does the Khoja migration intertwine with migration of other Gujarati and Indian communities to East Africa?
Well, the original migration to East Africa to Zanzibar was the Mashkatis, and these were essentially the large numbers of them were Khojas, although the Bhatias were also involved initially. They were the ones who came down from Muscat. They were the people who got the customs contracts, and they had these contracts even in Muscat. So it was a continuation with the Sultan that they came down. But the thing with the Hindu migrants to East Africa was that until very early in the 1900s, they wouldn't bring their spouses with them. So even though they were in Zanzibar for probably 150 years, they would go home and retire home. Big connection between Zanzibar and Mandri. There was a fleet in Mandri of ships, 16, 18 ships that made the annual trip down to Zanzibar in the monsoons, went back and forth, bringing produce and taking back the products of East Africa, copal and stuff like that. But it was always the men that came. So they never really put a foothold in East Africa. Particularly the upper castes, such as the Brahmins, they were against travel on the waters. It was a caste discipline that they would not travel the seas. So yes, it was an opportunity was taken advantage of by the Khojas because they were the ones who were around here, able to come. They brought their families and they made a home here.
So 2 questions, one from Nadia Darcy, will you have a part 2? And one from Nazneen, who or what inspired you to create the website Khoja Wiki?
Yeah, it's a good question because there were multiple levels at which I was inspired, but my first inspiration came because my son went to England to live, and at some point he needed to know where we were from. So I told him, "You're from India, my friend." And he said, "Yeah, but my friends are asking where in India." And I said, "Well, all I know is my grandfather was born in East Africa. And then beyond that, I know we're from somewhere in Gujarat, somewhere in maybe Kutch, because my father used to speak Kutchi." So he said, that's when I realized that in all the years that I was in East Africa and all the years that my father was here, my father was an educated man. He wrote books. He published magazines. And I was, at the point when I was here, I had 2 law degrees. And yet I had never actually sat down with my father and said, who was your great grandfather? I never asked him that. And I realized this amnesia that we have. Some call it that we are moving forward and therefore we really don't care about the past. Some call it a deliberate sort of self-negation, that we don't want to talk about our past because we are ashamed of our heritage or ashamed of who we were. Some think that, the British had an intention to wipe this history off our face so we could be used by the British to further their aims. Whatever it was, I live in Canada today. I'm a free man. I can search. I have the ability, and I have not done it. So I will not have an excuse to give to my grandson if I don't do this research. So I started researching, and I'm sad to tell you that if anyone's listening here, if you know any of the families from Sadani in 1875, my grandfather was called Muhammad Dewji, and I'm still trying to find out where he came from. So I'd love that information. But it's been a great journey because you learn things, incredible things about your family. My father was briefly in India from 1935 to 45. I was reading this book by this Indian Gujarati author about Gujaratis in East Africa, and he mentioned my father's book. He mentioned a publication that my father did in 1942. I didn't know about it. And I'm thrilled that this kind of thing runs in my family from 1942. So anyway, yeah, it's a personal journey.
Okay, so is there going to be part 2?
Yes, sir.
Okay. When Frida Versi, when our ancestors came in early 1900 to Tanzania, it was a German colony. So how were they able to take such risk?
Interesting question again, because before the Versis came to East Africa, others had already come, and they were in the Sultan's domain, which is basically Zanzibar and the coastal strip, and then few in places like Mpwapwa and Tabora and Gaze, which is Tabora, and then also at Kigoma. But most of these people were under the Sultan's flag, and then when the Germans came, they found them over there. And the Germans were very hostile to the Indians because the Indians were British subjects, first of all. Many of the Indians were, aligned to the British in terms of the politics of how the British took over Zanzibar, and were against the interest of the Germans and worked against the Germans. In fact, even during the war and earlier, during the time before the war. So the Germans were very hostile, and the Germans thought that these guys are taking away opportunities for German companies. But they very quickly realized that they could create little bomas, but they could not create the knowledge it took to deal with, to trade with the African tribes of the interior. I give you an example that Sultan Somji mentions in his book, in Bidbai. He talks about Bidbai, some lady around Kilimanjaro. And Bidbai, how she became a Bidbai was because in order to sell to the Maasais the beads that they liked, she needed to interact with Maasai elders who created designs based on the sky. It was not just the weather, but the design of the sky was what inspired the Maasais, and of course other things. And so she would take those designs, she learned to speak to them, learned their designs, then ship those designs off to, I think at that time the beads were coming from, I think in somewhere out there anyway, wherever it was not India, maybe it was India. So this would be, the information would go up the pipe and then come back, and then the kangas and everything that were coming back, the beads that were coming back were designed in a particular fashion. Same thing with Jivanijis. They did the same. They would get some guy, who was a guy in the coast, Swahili guy, and he wrote all those little sayings that you see at the bottom of those kangas. That was his job. Now, this kind of stuff, the Europeans had no clue how to get into it. And the Khojas had been there for a very long time. I didn't touch the history of Mombasa in my Khoja Wiki yet, because I'm scared to touch it, because I know there is a history behind the history behind the history. Khojas have been in Mombasa probably for 400 years, you know, but I don't know how to go about that. So we'll have to see. Yeah, but the Germans were hostile, but they could not replace the Indians. That's a short story to answer to Farida's question.
Azmul, we are at a 3:45 mark, so
Yep.
maybe take over.
Okay, so there is one question I think if you came across in your research, maybe you can answer that. Slavery and our
Yes.
role in that trade. Did you come across anything, or do you have any comments?
I have comments, yeah. Slavery was financed before the Khojas came into the picture. It was financed by some of the Bhatias who were here already, who were the Sultan's merchants, and they were the Sultan's customs collectors. So they were into it. The overwhelming role of the Khojas in the slavery business was to finance the expeditions that went interior. So they loaned the money and received the returns when the expeditions came back. Way back in the early part of the 1800s, slavery was not a big thing. It was ivory, which had been there for 200 years before that, right? Ivory was a big export from Zimbabwe, gold and ivory, and then it was export from East Africa. It was only when the French occupied some of the French islands that they demanded slaves for Reunion and Seychelles and other islands, that slavery became a big thing from here, from East Africa, right? And this slavery was then, the Khojas played that role. The Khojas themselves were prohibited by a treaty that was signed in 1830 between the ruler of Kutch and the British. British subjects were not allowed to have slaves. So they could not own slaves themselves. They had no slaves. Domestic, sometimes there were some, but they were not allowed to have slaves. But they did finance the expeditions that went out for a while. Tipu Tip, for example, had a good relationship with some of the people that went into the country.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I think you did a fantastic job, Iqbal. Obviously, you've done a lot of research. You packaged the presentation so well, and there's so much more you can talk about. I know that. So we will have to get you back. We will talk about it, and we'll see sort of when you can fit it in your schedule. I know you're busy researching and lots of other stuff to do. But I have to thank our audience. At least 85 of them were still with us. As I said earlier in my introduction, normally it's about an hour or maybe just over an hour. But there's so much information here to share, so we just continued. And maybe the next presentation will be advertised for much longer, and we'll give you plenty of time. Again, Iqbal, really appreciate your input, your comments, your insightful information and all that. Fantastic work. This presentation has been recorded, will be sent out to those in our database. If you want to join, then barazatoronto@gmail.com. Otherwise, you can always check YouTube in about 3 or 4 days' time. It should be up there. And a reminder about no meeting next week. The week after, presentation on Kashmir. And we're getting a scholar to give us the history and the current status of Kashmir and what's happening over there. Again, thank you all for sticking it out with us, and have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.